Are you tired of the cookie-cutter approach to education that's stuck in the last century? Are you seeking a win-win situation where your family thrives, your kid's education is revolutionary, and you still get to chase your own dreams? Welcome to Unschooled Unleashed. Unlock your child's genius. I'm your host, Matthew Jarecki, an unapologetic rebel dad and promoter of what many consider to be educational anarchy. You know the world isn't going to be won by those that just toe the line. It's the innovators, the visionaries, and the resilient spirits that are going to thrive. Our mission here is to forge those world changers within our very homes with less stress, energy, and time. Unschooled Unleashed starts now. Welcome back to another fantastic episode of Unschooled Unleashed. I'm your host, Matthew Jarecki, and today we're going to talk about consequences versus punishments. These are my own definitions. I created this whole framework for my household by myself after reading numerous books on parenting and education. So came up with this framework, and I'm here to tell you about it. So hopefully there's something good in there that you can take away as you make a decision on how you want to do this with your family. And I won't hold us back any longer. So with that, let's dive in. Today we're going to talk about discipline. All right, so this is punishments and consequences and all that stuff. And we're going to talk about how we do it in our family, my thoughts on it as of today in 2024. And my position's evolved over time, and that's why I'm actually bringing this up. I'm going to define out what I mean by consequences and punishments, but I'm going to make distinctions between the two. So let's talk about that real fast, and then I'm going to talk about the purpose of avoiding punishments, and then I'm going to talk about why we're talking about this on today's episode. The definition and impact of consequences and punishments and understanding the differences. A consequence is a direct result of a child's action, whether it's positive or negative, that teaches them the natural outcome of their behavior. Punishments, on the other hand, are imposed penalties that don't often relate to the behavior and are meant to cause discomfort or pain. Those are my definitions. So an example of a consequence, if a child hits their sibling, the natural consequence might be the sibling isn't going to be, you're not allowing the sibling to play with them anymore. They're not actually, that child that hit isn't allowed to play with anyone because we don't have the trust to allow them to play with someone without using their bodies, physically using their bodies, aggression, that kind of thing. And what I hope this teaches is that aggression leads to isolation. My friend, if I went over and hit him, he probably wouldn't want to be around me anytime soon. I might even lose a friend. This is directly tied to the action, right? And that's what we're trying to do, is get them to think deeper about what they're doing and how it affects their life. Here's an example of punishments, though. In contrast, the same child might lose video games for an evening for hitting their sibling. And the connection between hitting and isolation, ruining relationships, that kind of thing, isn't made. Child might focus on the unfairness of the timeout or of the losing video games rather than understanding the impact of their aggression. In our household, we strive to connect our children's actions with realistic outcomes. That's why we primarily 99.99% of the time use consequences, because I believe this approach builds their understanding and responsibility rather than just fostering resentment and confusion. And the reason why I think it might foster resentment and confusion, well, I'll go into that in a minute. Let me tell you my personal story and the purpose of all this. My son, one of my sons decided he was going to do whatever he wanted. We'd been using consequences this whole time, directly relating to his actions, which is very hard, by the way. This is a very hard approach. It takes a lot longer and a lot more creativity. But he got apathetic. He just said, okay, then he just took the consequences, really got apathetic. This is a habit of his, or what he was doing was a habit of, doing something to his brother. And he just didn't care anymore. And he was, on the other end, quote unquote, punishing me by not apologizing for his behavior because he treated me pretty poorly and some other stuff. So I decided that it was time to stop this behavior because it was affecting the entire family, and I'm in charge of the household. So I decided, you are going to stop this whether you like it or not. It is time for punishments. And it was the only way I could see getting there. Again, I want him to think about what he does. I want to make that close connection between his actions and the results of his actions. I do not want him to see me making up stuff to hurt him. I don't want that authoritarian parenting style. I want authoritative. But his apathy was very clear, and he did not try and hide it at all. So I decided to bring in punishments, and this was a big surprise to him. And he got grounded for the first time ever at 10 years old. This was a big deal in this house. Everyone's wide-eyed and looking around. I hated to do it, and this is why. I don't like to resort to punitive measures that can harm our relationship, and I instead want to focus on the consequences that naturally follow a child's action. And I think it promotes learning responsibility and just the supportive family dynamic where it's like, oh, you did that, now you can't play with anyone, we can't trust you. That's a result, right? Oh, you can't go to this big thing that you wanted to go to because you are out of control and you're affecting everyone. They really get tied to their behavior, but when they're apathetic, that was the line for me. And I was pretty committed to not do any punishments throughout their whole childhood. But I saw no other way, so had to move forward with it. But let's talk about the pitfalls. What are the pitfalls of punishing? And I've ad-libbed a lot of this, so I probably already touched on some of it, so I won't elaborate too much if I did. But I think there's a disconnect between the action and the result, and I've already mentioned this. I think it causes confusion for the child. I think if they're grounded for speaking out of turn or doing something that they might, this just isn't a direct result, and you're just going to say, well, you're picking something very hard that, I don't like, and I don't think it was that big of a deal, where it's harder to argue when you have consequences. I also think it's an authoritarian parenting style, and I lightly touched upon this, but let me explain. Punishments inherently involve an imposition of power, which can create a dynamic where the child feels controlled rather than guided. And that's not what I want. I want authoritative. That's guided. I walk with them. It's like if they get themselves in the bind, I have empathy. I try and be supportive. I try and do all that stuff, but I'm not lifting the consequence. Whereas punishments, now I'm imposing it on you. And I think it strains the relationship. And they view me as an adversary rather than a supporter. And I think there's long-term consequences to that. While punishments achieve short-term compliance very effectively, I have to admit it's very effective. Because you really don't have to explain. You're just like, you're grounded, you're this, you're that. Although I will explain things, even with punishments. I just don't think they foster that long-term behavior change that they need because I don't really understand why necessarily. I mean, I try and explain it to them, but I just don't think those connections are going to be as solid unless you use consequences. Children might learn to avoid getting caught as well, rather than understanding why their behavior was wrong. I just don't like that relationship, and that's one of the big reasons I want to walk beside them. I want to establish myself as that person that they can come to that's safe. Moving on, the power of consequences in parenting. So let's talk about consequences specifically now. So I've talked about why, the pitfalls of punishments and why I don't really want to use them, but it is very effective. And again, I said I hit my limit. But here's the power of consequences in parenting. I think it promotes accountability and self-reflection. When children face the consequences of their actions, right? They hit their brother, they can't play with anyone. They learn about responsibility. They understand that their choices have impacts, and I hope this makes it very, very, very memorable. I also think it encourages problem solving because I involve my children in problem solving this, involving them in deciding their consequences, they become an active participant in behavior management. And this process helps them develop critical thinking and problem solving skills, which are, I believe, invaluable to adulthood. So the way this works is, if it's hitting their sibling is very easy to solve, but sometimes it's not so easy for me. So let's say they lie and they have a habit of lying. That's a hard one, right? Because it damages relationships. You might go over and say, head to your room because you're impacting the family and I just can't have you interacting with people right now. But that only goes so far. Eventually, it's like, I want to punish because punishments seem like the only avenue, but I don't want to do that to them. So I actually put it on them. I say, it seems like you're developing a habit of lying. Put yourself in my shoes. What would you do? I don't want to punish you. I don't want to just make up stuff. But this needs to stop because I'm responsible for maintaining harmony in this household. We've all agreed to the same rules. There's no special rules for you. There's no special rules for me. What would you do in my position? What do you want done to help you solve this problem? A lot of times they decide to punish themselves, which is kind of weird. But I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing because, usually it's I'll lose a night of video games or something like that. They still are connecting the dots, at least this is what I see, between their actions and the result. And they're using that to try and help them stop a poor behavior. This is a great, great thing to take into adulthood because we often have poor behaviors and sometimes we need that accountability to stop something. So you might tell a friend, hey, if I don't do, my daily reading that I've committed to, then I'm going to tell you about it and what I'm going to do in response, and you're going to ask me about it. So I know you're going to be asking me about it. What I'm going to do in response is I may do a 24-hour fast. That's actually what I did one time as an accountability thing to my friend. That was the first time I ever fasted, by the way. I didn't even think I could do it. But I was grilling out. It was grueling because I had to cook food for everybody and it was good food. And I'm like, I got to fast for 24 hours. Can't eat this food. I learned my lesson. Let's just say that. And I directly tied it to my behavior. I decided to stop that behavior. And I think that's a very effective thing to learn how to do as a kid, is to correct your own behavior. Sometimes we need a little bit more. We need a little bit of accountability from others. And that's really what I was trying to build there. Also within the benefits of consequences is it strengthens the parent-child relationship. Using consequences over punishments helps maintain a positive and supportive dynamic, that authoritative style of parenting. The child sees the parent as a guide rather than a disciplinarian, although they will try and blame you sometimes, but you just keep on pointing back and say, if you didn't do this, we wouldn't have been in this position. What am I supposed to do? Let you do this forever? We all have the same rules in this household, but you're crossing the line continually. What am I supposed to do? And they kind of stop after that, at least my kids do. And I think this deepens the trust and communication when I'm walking alongside with them, giving them a hug when they're crying because they don't like the consequences. And I'm going, I don't want to do this either. I don't want to do this either. I want you to use the easy way, not the hard way. The hard way is learning from your consequences. The easy way is learning from my words. Please do that because I've said it a million times before this. When our kids make a mistake, we actually talk it out first. And we do this many times before we actually have consequences because I want them to learn from the minimum force necessary, right? If they can learn from talking it out, good. They talk nasty. Hey, knock it off. You don't want to hurt people, do you? No. Okay, thank you. But if they're starting to make a habit out of it, consequences need to come out. And I don't do it any longer than I think they need to learn the lesson. Sometimes, again, that lesson isn't learned, and that's when I bring out punishments, potentially. We always step it up in the consequence realm. But my goal is to stay on their team and establish myself not as that person forcing them to do something, but as like, hey, this is a result of your actions. I'm here to help you. I love you. And we normally, like, even if we send them to their room for something, like they have to isolate, I don't say what they can and can't do in their room when I'm giving them consequences. They just have to do something else, which really takes away a lot of it. But I think they see the grace in it, because we want a love and grace-based household. And I think they see when I do that, at least my kids have, that I'm not trying to make their life miserable. This is a result of their action. You can't be around other people. Well, can I write? Can I read? Yeah, you can do whatever you want. Just stay in that room by yourself. Don't talk to anyone. I'll come find you when we're done. And that's how it works. Moving on, how to effectively implement consequences. So, 1, we need to explain the consequences clearly. Again, this isn't the first time they've done this, because you've tried to teach them the easy way, which is talking and correcting the behavior through that. But when they don't, you got to explain the consequences and make sure you're doing it clearly. Always ensure that they understand why the consequence is happening. This is the most important thing. This explanation is crucial for them to make a connection between their actions and their outcome. Keep the consequences relevant is the next step. Make sure the consequences are directly related to the behavior. This relevance is what makes consequences an effective learning tool. For instance, if a child breaks a toy in anger, the consequence might be that they can't use another toy until they've demonstrated calm behavior. In fact, you might even take away their toys for the rest of the day, because you don't want to risk those toys being broken. They might even lose the expensive toys, the ones they really like video games. Because because they might break the TV, they might break, the Nintendo Switch or whatever they're playing on. This is a little bit looser, but it is still a consequence, and you can make that argument. You can just say, "Look, I bought this. It's very expensive. Your behavior's out of control. You're not in charge right now. I am in charge. I'm going to take charge to make sure that this stuff is still going to be able to be used by everyone. The video games." So you're not allowed to play video games. Don't use any of the toys. I'll let you know when that's going to change. We need to build up some trust first. That's how that conversation goes. I also use minimal force. So I only apply as much consequence as necessary to the child so they learn their lesson. And that's it. I want to avoid over-penalizing, because I think that can lead to feelings of unfairness and resentment, and that's what I don't want to do. Although they can view it however they want, but I'm trying, as they reflect, hopefully they see that. I definitely don't want to be too harsh. And one of the ways I do that also is allowing them to choose their consequence if it goes to that level. Again, that's not step 1 or 2. It's probably step 3 if it continues. It's on the verge of a habit. Step 1, talk. This is something they just acted out. Okay, fine. We talk about it. We move on. If they continue to do it, then we have a consequence, whatever that might be. And if they continue to do it from there on out, usually this is when I see it being developed as a habit, and I'll say, it looks like you're committed to continuing this. It looks like it's turning into a habit. We got to stop this. I can't figure it out. You figure it out, or I'm just going to, or like you're going to leave it on me to figure it out. And I don't think you want that, because it's probably going to be a little bit easier for you to figure out what you want to do. And they usually choose something, and punishments are absolute last resort in my household. So minimum force. I've covered this quite a bit, involving children in the process, but let me just make sure I caught everything here. You want this to be collaborative decision-making when you involve your children in the process of choosing their consequence. Again, this is not the first time they've done it, or the second. This is, you're up there. It's becoming a habit, or it is a habit. And you're saying, this needs to stop. Like, we need to put something in the way so your brain remembers and you think twice. So what consequence do you want? And this doesn't have to be related necessarily to the action, okay? So they could say video games, and it might just be they're talking nasty. All right. They choose whatever they want, and that connection is still there, I believe. At least that's what I've seen. Ask them what they think is fair. Ask them what they would do in your shoes. This empowers them to think like an adult. They're going to have to think like this one day about their kids. May as well start thinking about it now. They're going to have to think about it for their life and preparing them for adulthood. Start thinking about it now. I also think this teaches, involving them in the process teaches self-regulation, because by participating in this process, they learn self-regulation. They start to anticipate their consequences, the consequences of their actions, so they can make better choices independently. And I think this is a critical life skill as well. I also think involving them builds empathy. When children are involved in setting the consequences, they also learn empathy because they begin to see how their actions affect others, which can lead to more considerate behavior overall. Because they see how it affects you in the position you're in. They see how it affects the rest of the family. And like you talk about that with them too. And you say, it's affecting the family so much. Like we need to change this. And what we're doing has not worked. And again, this is after a couple of iterations. It's starting to become a habit. What do we do? We can't. Do you think this should change? This behavior should continue? And they always say no. They don't think it should. Okay, well, we either fix it or we let it continue. And I can't let this continue. This needs to stop. Then they jump in. So let's compare the long-term effects between punishments and consequences. As far as the behavioral development, consequences definitely get the why behind their behavior change, why they need to change. And that's very important. I don't think punishments do that. I think the emotional impact, punishments often lead to feelings of shame or fear, and this can negatively impact their self-esteem, whereas consequences, if you frame, you can frame anything in whatever way to make it really bad, but I like to frame it as, hey, this needs to stop. This behavior is affecting the family, and building that empathy. And I always frame it, we're all sinners. We all do stuff wrong, and we're going to make mistakes. The consequences happen, but we don't need to, continue this. Like, you're better than that. We just need to get this to stop. But there are consequences to your actions. And I think this is just a more constructive way to help your child develop emotionally and connecting the dots. I think it also builds, consequences build trust in communication, because you're in discussion with them, you're walking alongside with them. But punishments really kind of shut down the communication. That's kind of the goal, is to shut down everything. Boom, you're in punishment. You're not allowed to do this, not allowed to do that. I don't want to talk about it anymore. It's kind of the inherent nature of punishments, although you can try and explain stuff. It's just it might be a lost cause, my fear. We also, moving on, have grace and forgiveness. So we want a loving household and a graceful household. That's our goal. And so grace is a big part of it. So they deserve something in their consequences, but we oftentimes give a lot of grace. So balancing discipline with compassion. Consequences don't have to be harsh to be effective. Incorporating grace and forgiveness into your parenting approach shows their child that everyone makes mistakes, but what's important is learning and growing from them. Again, they might be sent to their room, but they can do whatever they want. I'm not trying to be mean here. Yeah, you can do this, you can do that. Please change. I'm on your team. We offer them a second chance a lot of times. Like, hey, you deserve this, but we're not going to do this. Especially if we see like they might actually be hearing us. So sometimes the child might not fully understand the consequence of their action until after it happened. So offering a second chance or reducing the consequence if they sincerely show understanding and remorse can be powerful. And this teaches the value of compassion and the importance of personal growth on their end, as well as establishing us as on their team, as opposed to the disciplinarian. We also like to demonstrate grace in other ways. So grace doesn't mean eliminating consequences, but rather applying them with understanding and love sometimes. It's about teaching that their actions have while their actions have results, there's always room for learning and redemption. So we like to sometimes just say, hey, you deserve this, but we're not going to actually apply all of that. If you can learn your lesson, we might go over and say, hey, you can't be around people, but they really, really, really show that they know they did something wrong. They did not mean to. They were truly trying. And we just say, hey, look, you deserve to be in there all night, but we're going to give you grace. Come on out. We love you. We want you to be in this. Please don't do this anymore. Grace is probably as effective, one of the most impactful tools that we have, because it really lets them know that you're on their team, like that you go the consequences. Man, why'd you do this? Now we can't, have you come with us. But then you can give them grace. Like, for example, my son, he was acting out. We went to this thing called Roboland. And we were taking my niece and nephew for their birthdays, so we took our kids too. And it was, these robots and artificial intelligence. It was pretty cool. But my son was acting up last minute. We couldn't take him. And I just said, you're going to disrupt everything. I'm not taking that away from your cousins. And he wasn't able to go, and he really, really, really wanted to go. He's like the one who's into that stuff. But what I did is, a week later, I ended up taking him on my own. And we just went, me and him. And I think that actually built the relationship up a little bit more. It also let him know that I'm on his team, that I didn't want this to happen. And I made sure to reinforce that along the way. So grace is definitely playing a role in our household. Moving on. We work together. We have rules in our house, and we all agree to these rules. This is a framework, okay? To all get along. We all have to get along in this house. So what we do is we agree to the rules, like treat others how you would want to be treated if you were them, which means we don't steal from each other. We don't lie. We don't manipulate. We don't, all these different things, right? So that's the rule. Oftentimes my kids will break these rules. We have an agreement on what the rules are, and then they'll argue and say how what they did was justified. And really they're just rationalizing it. So what I do is I make sure I focus on what we've agreed to. Well, we all agreed that lying is not going to happen in this house. We've all agreed that stealing something or taking something without asking if it's someone else's, that you're not allowed to do that. That's what we set up. That's what you agreed to. And you're telling me that there is a special exception for you today. No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that this time is different. And I have them explain it to me, and it, rarely makes sense, right? Unless there's a misunderstanding somewhere deeper. They took from, my son took from my other son, and he didn't ask, and the one's upset about it, and he's trying, and the other one, and the one who took is trying to tell me how it's okay, right? And I just say, hey, we had this rule. You're asking for different rules, is what I hear you asking for. If you would like to change those rules, to test it out, to see what it's like, to play by the rules that you're playing by with your actions, then we can. But I don't think you want that, because that means that everyone can take your stuff without asking, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, do you want to continue to argue that you should be able to take your brother's stuff anytime you want? If they say yes, I am tempted, I have not done it yet because they've never said yes, to actually let that happen. That's a hard lesson. That's a consequence. But they usually say no, and the argument's settled right there. That's our family agreement. I think, I'm going to cover this one last thing. There's a couple more things I wanted to cover, but I think we're running up against the clock here. I'm just going to skip to the end. Some actionable tips for implementing consequences effectively. One, you got to be consistent in applying consequences. That's one of the keys. Inconsistent application leads to confusion and it undermines the effectiveness of this approach. Okay, so you got to be consistent. Always explain it. And you have to directly tie it to it, right? So tailor the consequences to the child as well, because each child is unique, and what works as a consequence for one might not work for another. So tailor it to fit their personality and their understanding and their age, as appropriate. Use natural consequences whenever possible, because this is the most natural thing that they can learn from. This method is the most powerful because it directly links the child's action with the results, and you're not the enemy. The sin's the enemy. The action's the enemy. Stay calm and composed. Way easier said than done. The goal is to be that authoritative parent where you're walking alongside with them and teaching them. This is easiest for me with my daughter for some odd reason, but it's not very easy for me with my sons. I often get angry, frustrated, exacerbated. But when I'm doing my best type of parenting, I'm calm and composed and consistent, and they can see that I'm not just trying to hurt them. Even when I'm angry about the whole thing, they can see that, I think. And then encourage reflection. Ask them a question if they say they don't know. I often say, I don't know means I don't want to think, because I'm asking you your best guess as to why this might have happened, or what happened, or whatever the question might be. Just give it your best guess. And if they say, I don't know, that's not a good enough answer for me. And that leads to the consequence lasting longer, oftentimes. But usually they come up with a pretty good understanding of maybe why they chose what they chose. And, this will help reinforce the lesson and support their growth. So with that, I'm going to end today's episode. So stay curious, stay unschooled, and stay away from the algebra nightmares. I'll catch you in the next episode. So here's where we roll up our sleeves and bring out the big guns. If you support our mission, then please leave a review. On Unschooled Unleashed, we are talking about using a radical approach to education in today's world, and the more 5-star reviews we have, the more people will feel comfortable with the ideas, strategies, and principles we discuss. It gives legitimacy to our message, and the podcast's algorithm prioritizes us so we can reach more people. You may even have your 5-star review read on our podcast. Before I let you go, I have to pause and say this from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Your presence here is the fuel that ignites this movement. I am incredibly moved that you trust in us enough to click play. You, my friends, are the caped heroes in this story, the guardians of your family's learning journey, and a beacon of hope for your community. Be bold. Do what you think is best for you and your family. Thanks again for tuning in and taking this courageous leap outside of the box for this educational revolution. Welcome to the front line.